So I'll be moderating today. Okay, so we're going to get started. Firstly, I just wanted to take the time to welcome everyone into this session, into this very important conversation. And I wanted to thank everyone for taking time out of their schedule to come and share their expertise, experiences, tactics as well into this conversation, and everybody joining in the audience. Thank you so much. Feel free to ask questions, engage in the comment section. We've got Sandy who will also be looking through it, looking through the comment section. My name is Lazola Gadi, and I am the Fossil Ad Ban Campaign Manager. And basically, the point of this conversation is for all of us in this panel who are advocating for a fossil fuel ad ban from different parts of the world to engage, to talk successes, not so great moments, challenges, strengths, and how we can take it forward. And most importantly, why a fossil ad ban is very important. So I am just going to get started on that point. So I'm just going to set essentially, I guess, what we would call the intellectual point of why we need a fossil ad ban, because this conversation has been a long time conversation. It's been happening within the global space. The fossil ad ban campaign is trying to bring it into the regional space, into the global south, and into South Africa. So, opening thoughts when we had basically started thinking about putting together this webinar were around the speech that was basically given by Dr. Maria Neira, Director of the World Health Organization, Public Health, Environment, and Social Determinants of Health Department. Very long department, very long name. But the idea behind it was a line that basically Dr. Maria put out, which is fossil fuels are the new tobacco. And we need to fight against their lobbying, against their advertising, and against their glamorization. So the idea here is that we all look at tobacco as poison. Why was there a need for a tobacco ban? Why was the tobacco ban something that sparked a conversation? Why that product? And to have fossil fuels being compared directly to tobacco, we thought to ourselves, it's the same with the advertising tactics. So this is also part of why we decided to come together today. And this statement by Dr. Maria sets the scene for today's discussion. If fossil fuels are the new tobacco, what does that mean for how we regulate their advertising, sponsorship, and influence? Today, we will explore how campaigners, policymakers, regulators, and civil society are responding across different countries, and how sharing these experiences can strengthen the global movement for fossil fuel advertising bans and climate accountability. So, first up, we're going to have Peter from Fossil Free Football. And essentially, Peter, I would just like you to take us through why sports washing is so important. What is sports washing? And why fossil fuel advertising matters within sports washing itself.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here and chat to you guys today. I mean, fossil fuel companies are quite desperate right now. I think they're quite concerned about global backlash to a business model that depends on fossil fuel pollution, and they're looking desperately around for a solution that can kind of keep their party going and keep the profits rolling in. And they see sport as a really powerful way of doing that. So I think, to be honest, it's useful to just imagine for a second, put yourself in the shoes of a kind of executive or a CEO or a major shareholder in a company that whose profit is directly tied to fossil fuel pollution. Imagine how you would feel in that situation if you were an oil and gas company. So Aramco is a major sponsor of global football, or Total Energies is a huge sponsor of African football, or an airline, which is everywhere in football, or a polluting car maker. You would be looking around, and you would be incredibly concerned about the kind of rising global desire for climate action, Imagine how you would have felt in 2019 looking at tens of millions of people on the street calling for rapid transition away from fossil fuels. Imagine how you'd feel when you see kind of surging renewable energy and electro tech coming through, as well as kind of global climate disasters, which are pushing people towards more rapid climate action. So, if you imagine yourself as one of those people, you'd be feeling quite concerned and quite desperate right now to somehow change the story and to continue to normalize your business model, which relies on polluting fossil fuels, which we all know are making the problem worse. And so those guys are looking around desperately for a solution, and they have landed on sport as a really powerful way to kind of change the story of their brand, not just from something that is polluting and damaging, but by wrapping that brand around something that people love really dearly. Yeah, if you want, I can go into the kind of mechanisms of sports sponsorship a bit more specifically, because yeah, it is super, super powerful.
Thank you so much, Peter. And definitely, we want to dig deeper into this. And I think just speaking about the rebrand, which is how I'm thinking about it in my head, I was watching the World Cup and the many amounts of hydration breaks that came about. And I mean, that for me personally was a culture shock. We grew up watching football, but you didn't see that many hydration breaks. They just kept on coming and coming. And obviously, within the space, we're looking at this and thinking ourselves, these are the reasons we're calling for proper climate action. These are the reasons because there really is a change in climate. And I guess just digging deeper into these global companies, or rather these fossil fuel companies, they're already household names. We're talking about Total Energies. Yes, they're the 14th biggest CO2 emitter, but they're a big oil giant, you know? Why do you think that they continue investing millions in football sponsorship? What makes sports such a
Mm.
powerful platform for the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, I mean, often sponsorship and advertising is sort of taken for granted, especially as a football fan. And it was interesting. You mentioned the hydration breaks. That was actually an interesting moment for us because for once, the whole world was talking about this issue of advertising being inserted into the football match, which usually it's a bit more challenging for us to kind of get the conversation going around the issue of advertising. People don't take it that seriously, perhaps, or they kind of take it for granted. The World Cup was different. So that was a little bit of a gift for our campaign in a way. But yeah, why do they do this? I mean, a corporation does not pour a lot of money into something. They're not charities. It's not a philanthropic thing. They want a return on that investment. So obviously they want to drive sales. And if you're an airline or a car maker, you want to sell flights and sell cars. But it certainly goes deeper than that as well. Because as I said, these industries are fighting for their lives right now as they see it, and they're really desperate. And I think there's a particular insight that they have that I think maybe our movement and the climate movement has kind of forgotten or perhaps lacks. And I think that comes from the fact that we feel like we have science and data and rationality on our side. And they realize that actually the key battle here is not necessarily a battle for kind of rational information. It's not just about providing information to people and they'll make a rational policy choice to get away from fossil fuels. Humans and societies are much more about values and status and belonging and irrational and intangible ideas like that. And so they realize that if they can kind of win in that sphere, they'll never win in the rational kind of science-based sphere, but they can win simply by better understanding these ideas of kind of values and identities, and by getting really closely intertwined with something that people really love, which is sport. I think they understand that the world is quite fragmented, and that sport is one of the only things that continues to bring massive amounts of people together in a collective kind of shared ritual, where people will come, week in, week out to take part in this shared ritual. It's a very collective thing that millions of people do, and that's quite rare in society these days. So they think that if they can get deeply involved in something that is held very dear to people, that people are extremely loyal to, that is a big part of their routine and their rituals, then they can kind of change what is clearly a quite abnormal thing, which is continuing to promote pollution during the climate crisis. They can normalize that thing and they can shift the kind of perception of it by playing on people's loyalty, by being deeply connected to something that they really love and really hold dear. And so, yeah, sport grants them access to the hearts and minds of billions of fans around the world. The other side of that is that sport grants them access to VIPs and key decision makers. If you watch the World Cup, you would have seen like every 2 minutes on the screen, you'd have a new celebrity or prime minister or president, VIP, head of states, monarchs. Everyone who is important in the world is actually involved in this thing as well. And so if you sponsor the World Cup, you get access as a CEO of a polluting company to these very important people. We actually saw at the World Cup final the boss of Aramco on the field shaking hands with Donald Trump, presenting the Young Player Award, which his company was sponsoring. So it's about access to the hearts and minds of billions of fans, but also these really important VIPs. And that is the strategy that they have for kind of changing the game and normalizing their brand at this stage, even though it's completely crazy and abnormal to be promoting pollution this kind of deep into the climate crisis.
Mm. And I guess, I mean, you've delved deeper into like how they're protecting their image during this crisis, because right now it's a situation of kind of putting themselves in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They're creating belonging. And I think that's one of the most disturbing things, even within the fossil ad ban in South Africa, we come across when sitting down and workshopping communities, affected communities, is to make them realize that, listen, this advert is not necessarily about informing you. It's about making you feel part of a community so that you don't look at this community and realize how toxic it is and how dangerous it is for the environment and for your life. Um, but then I think then it brings me to a question, because during the World Cup there was a push and pull. There was a good moment for us who are pushing for fossil ad ban, obviously for fossil free football, but there was also still opposing voices. And you still had some football fans that are saying it's normal, move with the times, hydration breaks aren't that deep. How, or rather why, should football fans care? And what happens when one of the world's most influential sports becomes a platform for greenwashing and sports washing?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big question. And when people ask why fans care, I kind of should say, why should anyone care? I think we should all care, both for moral and idealistic reasons, but also for basic reasons of self-interest and self-preservation. If you're planning to be around for the next few decades, this issue is going to dominate your life, so you really should care. But why should football fans care specifically? They should care because football is so obviously really exposed to worsening extreme weather. There's no football without a safe place to play outside. And we all know that kind of more rain and flooding on the one hand, but also heat and smoke and droughts is terrible for football, and football just simply can't thrive in those conditions. We're seeing at lower levels more games being cancelled than ever. Kids who can't get into sport and fall in love with the game because of heat or flooding that's kind of removing their accessibility. But then even at the very highest level, at the level where there's billions of dollars involved, they have all the money in the world to protect themselves, they are still highly exposed to things like extreme heat. We saw in 2024 an assistant referee actually collapsed during a match at the Copa America in the US from heat exhaustion. Next year, the same thing at the Club World Cup. Heat was a major talking point for the safety of players and fans. And then this year again at the World Cup, heat was a huge issue. And you couldn't kind of go 2 minutes of consuming any kind of football related content without heat being brought up as a real problem. So I think fans recognize that. One thing that appeals to a certain type of fan as to why they should care is basically the only thing that FIFA will do to take any kind of well, not climate action, but climate adaptation is move the World Cup from its traditional time slot in June and July to the winter. So if you're a fan, there are many kind of hundreds of millions of fans who really love the tradition of watching football outside with friends and family in the middle of the European summer. And it looks like we're going to lose that beautiful tradition. Maybe that will benefit some people in different parts of the world who would prefer that. But for me and many other people, that is a really tragic development. And I would rather fight for football that can still be played in June and July rather than just kind of meekly surrendering and giving up and just moving it to the winter. And the final thing is that, it's if you love a football club and you really care about the values of that club, and that club kind of betrays you by taking on a polluting sponsor that does not align with your values of kind of having a positive impact in the world. Yeah, that's a deeply hurtful and offensive thing. And a lot of fans see that. They love their club, but they see their club is associated with a harmful product or industry, and they find that really, really offensive and hurtful. And that's something that really motivates them to get in the fight as well. So yeah, there's a few different reasons why fans should care. But if you love football, you can really see how exposed it is, and that's why we need to fight.
Yeah. 100%. And I mean, we've seen over decades, even recently, how much power football fans actually have in their clubs. We've had clubs change PR tactics, change social media strategy based on the critique or rather the discomfort of fossil fuel fans. And I think that's a very important point to highlight because a lot can be done should football fans unite, care. I mean, just the type of football fans you've highlighted could do so much, you know. And which brings me to more of a focus on your guys' campaign. So your campaign has shown that sports can be a powerful space to challenge greenwashing and sports washing. Could you share an example of how fossil-free football has influenced public debate or decision makers? And what does this tell us about the role of sport in advancing the broader movement of fossil fuel advertising bans? Perhaps you can also dig deeper into the mechanisms you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose I can talk about our campaign with FIFA and Aramco. So Aramco is the world's biggest oil company. It's owned by the Saudi state, and it's sponsored FIFA and the World Cup since 2024. So we want to basically organize players and fans to kind of reject that deal and demand that it be dropped. So we organized the first professional player to speak out against that deal. Then there was an amazing effort by more than 130 professional female footballers to call for the deal to be ended, and we didn't lead that, but we kind of supported as best we could as well. We then organized the first male player to speak out against the deal. The first group of male players, the first group of kind of organized fans as well to speak out. And then as the World Cup came closer, we wanted to really land the point that players and fans were dangerously exposed to extreme heat at the World Cup. And so we organized a group of world leading heat safety experts, kind of scientists and doctors and sports scientists, to call on FIFA to change its approach to the issue of heat to do more to protect players. And then as part of the open letter that they sent to FIFA, there was also a section in there about the kind of conflict of interest that you have as FIFA when you're obligated to protect players as your kind of main priority, but then you're also promoting the world's biggest oil company that's making heat worse. So we kind of called out that conflict of interest. And then we organized a group of over 70 players to kind of come out and back that letter and to kind of express the concerns that the kind of heat experts expressed as well. And then, as the World Cup kind of continued, we worked really hard on social media as well. I think I personally am a little bit concerned that a lot of our allies and progressive organizations and climate groups have kind of stepped back from social media or deprioritized it, or it kind of feels a little bit like ground has been ceded to our opponents online. And I find that really troubling, especially when you're looking at the kind of content that young men are particularly exposed to online. And fossil-free football is quite well positioned, obviously, because we're centered on football that so many young people love. We're quite well positioned to kind of get into those conversations and hopefully expose people to different types of content, different viewpoints that they wouldn't otherwise get. So we worked really hard to kind of raise awareness about the campaign on social media, and we managed to get kind of, 1.5 million views on our content during the tournament, which I was really satisfied with for like a small platform. So it was really nice to kind of be in the fight and give people a place where they could kind of push back against this deal and express their frustration with the way that football is being run. And then yeah, we don't really kind of lobby kind of key decision makers too much. We're more about kind of building a movement from the outside, showing that players and fans are desperate for climate action in football, and kind of showing that there's demand for policy making there. But having said that, we did kind of support an allied group who were getting involved with some members of the European Parliament on FIFA and Aramco, engaging them on football governance issues, and we kind of supported them in hosting an event at the European Parliament during the World Cup. So it was really nice to see some politicians starting to sense that this is something that is really important to people. Um, so yeah, that's a little bit about our campaign, and then I suppose the power of sport is simply that it's so massive. As I said, the world's quite fragmented. It's quite hard to reach a lot of people with a message at the moment. People are living in different online bubbles, but sport is something that brings people together in a massive way. And so if you yeah, it's a bit cheesy, but if you change sport, you can change the world. I think like that is undeniable. And I suppose people understand sport as something that doesn't necessarily need to be hyper commercialized. There is more to sport than just kind of squeezing profit out. So perhaps it's a good venue for those kind of conversations, as opposed to some others, which are kind of more vital parts of the economy. And it also opens up possibilities for important arguments about the importance of health. Sport is something associated with health, but it should not be promoting things that are toxic. And then also young people. Young people are heavily involved in sports. Young people are going to bear the brunt of the climate crisis over the decades to come. So the idea that young people are being used to promote big oil like, is something that doesn't sit right with people. So yeah, the idea that kind of footballers are very young, very healthy and athletic, and they're being used to promote pollution, opens up some important kind of messaging points for us in our campaign as well. And that's part of the power of sport as well.
Yeah. And I mean, it's absolutely great because even during the World Cup, we're seeing more and more youth kind of speak about climate action, climate accountability, and raise these nuances. Um, and I think it beats all these allegations that youth aren't necessarily in tune. Particularly within football, kind of taking pollution out of football, but having the youth actually speak about it, connect the dots in the youth space has been, from my view, and some of us colleagues watching, so rewarding. And I guess this brings us to what are the challenges of convincing football institutions to move away from fossil fuel sponsorships, and how have you responded to that resistance? Because I know in the Global South perspective, the complaint has been Global South sports doesn't have a lot of sponsorship outside of fossil fuel industry. So what do you want us to do? So from your side of the world, what have been the challenges?
Yeah, I suppose the challenge is the fact that football has become hyper commercialized and hyper financialized. And money is everything in elite level sport. Clubs fear that passing up an opportunity to take sponsorship money would mean one of their rivals takes that money, and then they kind of lose competitive advantage. Um, and another challenge that we've had in kind of engaging them directly is the fact that if you're talking to an organization about sustainability, you might often be kind of connected to the sustainability manager, who, in my experience, is not necessarily someone that has much power in the organization, especially decision-making power over commercial arrangements, which is what we really want to talk about. The sustainability manager of a football club will be concerned with things like recycling and single-use plastics, but good luck in engaging them on the issues of sponsorship. So we want to see we want to be kind of in the heads of the commercial departments and the PR departments, and I suppose that's the power of a kind of big outside movement putting pressure on them to do better. We want to make the case that if you sign a polluting sponsor, there will be significant backlash from players and fans. that you will take a reputational hit from that, and other sponsors may turn away from you because they don't want to be associated with a toxic brand. And so sometimes you kind of have to play that game where you have to kind of hit them where it hurts and make a case that they will lose out financially from this. Um, and that's just the reality in the kind of hyper commercialized world of sports. Having said that, there is I would say the benefit for our campaign is that most football fans are disgusted by how hyper commercialized the sport has become, and they would be quite happy to see a return to the days when football was not dominated by hedge funds and private equity and creepy billionaires. And so we can make that kind of case. And the climate argument doesn't necessarily have to even be at the forefront of that. I think it would be a huge win for our campaign if we were able to revert away from a hyper commercialized football, because then obviously you're reducing the power of massive fossil fuel companies as well. So yeah, and that's an important lesson as well, is to kind of meet your potential campaign targets where they are, and kind of listen to them and ensure that your own messaging is kind of directed to their concerns as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, parting from fossil fuel football right now. Last question. How can you see, or rather, how do you wish campaigns working on sports washing, greenwashing, fossil fuel lobbying, and advertising bans better collaborating to build a stronger global movement for climate accountability?
I mean, I think, as I said, that kind of sponsorship and advertising is often something that people take for granted a little bit, or they don't take seriously, or they don't understand or really grapple with. So I do think, despite what I said about the kind of the over importance of kind of data and science and research and policy sometimes in our movement, I do think when it comes to this issue, we need more understanding about the power of advertising, whether that's kind of, media taking an interest in the amounts of money involved, getting scoops on who is paying what for what service, or researchers helping people understand the impact of advertising. For example, understanding the way that sports sponsorship shifts people's attitudes and opinions towards polluting industries. I think that understanding is missing a little bit. Or even kind of like you mentioned the tobacco parallel before. I think having even, historians kind of explaining to people the way that things used to be when tobacco advertising was ubiquitous, and the way that we evolved away from that over time, and made society healthier as a benefit. I think more kind of storytelling on issues like that would be powerful. With it in our movement more specifically, I suppose, everyone says this, but we always need to collaborate more closely. I think that relies on building connection and trust between different groups, and that's why having more contact, doing more events like this is so important to kind of bring people together. So yeah, I think it's important to kind of have more powerful storytelling about the power of advertising, and then yeah, continue to build trust and network and collaborate through events like this. So yeah, it's great that you guys have had the initiative to put this on, because I think that's a really powerful part of movement building.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks, Peter. Totally agreed
Pleasure.
on highlighting the influence of advertising. I think last year, when we released Africa's first greenwashing report, one of the taglines, or rather the statistics that grabbed a lot of people, was how we measured that 30.5 million rand was spent by the top six fossil fuel companies in South Africa to advertise over 2 months. And that, in fact, yes, that reached over 15 million people. And we also then looked at how long it would take for someone to be influenced by greenwashing in an advert. And through studies, obviously, science, data collection, what we came up with, or rather came down to, was only 30 seconds of exposure to an advert that is perpetuating greenwashing is enough to change the opinions of the viewer. And I think highlighting, just piggybacking off what you said on highlighting the importance and the power of advertising and influence of advertising, those types of statistics, stories are so important for the wider public to know, because You're right. A lot of people think that advertising is just advertising, but there's a reason why there are advertising departments, billions and millions that are invested in the advertising industry. So thank you so much for highlighting that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Next up, we're going to dig deeper into communications. So I'm going to start off with Samantha, particularly because we want to look into communications as a institution, as a strategic sort of implementation within the world. Hi, Samantha. Just want to see if
Hi,
you can.
Lazola. Thank you
How are
for the
you?
invitation. I'm fine, glad for the invitation to speak with all of you today.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. I think it's in the morning on your side of the world. But I'm introducing Samantha Costa, who is the communications coordinator for the Institute Climate Politics. Yes. So, first up, Samantha, around the world, we are seeing an increasing amount of scrutiny of greenwashing. So, why are governments, regulators, and civil society paying so much closer attention to fossil fuel communications?
Perfect, Lazola. So fossil fuels are increasingly at the center of public debate precisely because there is a growing global awareness that we can no longer depend on and this energy source that leaves the entire world vulnerable. So there is a growing understanding that the burning of fossil fuels is the main cause of the climate crisis. We are also going through an institutional crisis since the United States climate conferences, the famous COPs. Um, have failed, right, to clearly address this challenge in their negotiations rooms, the tests. So this is increasingly sparkling outrage that we cannot really solely on these forums to achieve a just transition. So this scenario, which I call an awakening, so we are awakening slowly, has been further intensified by the raising of full prices in all the world following the war between the United States and Iran. We know about that. So, which causes one of the greatest energy crises in our history. So, by paralyzing oil tanker traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. So, for all these reasons, I believe this creates a major window of opportunity for communications, for decision makers, and the civil society to push for regulations for these industries, such as a ban on fossil fuel advertising.
100%. I mean, highlighting, I think, in as much as we would like to highlight how COP is helpful, but honestly, there have been how many pathways, there have been how many budgets, how many protests, and how many promises that have been unkept. I mean, you look at the number that a lot of movements came out with last year in terms of investments, and you can see that there's so little willingness, and we can only hope that this year the level of advocacy and movement building around centering climate and fuel prices when it came to the war can pressure and give us a better pathway or better, I guess, promises and fossil fuel advertising and actual policy commitments from COP this year. How does strategic communication shape public understanding of climate change? And how does it influence political debate and build support for stronger climate policies from your perspective?
Okay. So, the oil industry uses the media to convince people that it's a good thing to keep extracting oil in order to invest in a just transition energy. So, which is a lie, or in another words, it's a greenwashing, right? Because at least in Brazil, only about 11% of the total budget of our leading energy producer, the Petrobras, the company, uh, only 11% is invested in energy sources. So it's very few in comparing with all the money that they receive, right? They gain. So just as the fossil fuel industry manages to convince people of all this, I believe we can also use the same power, but for the greater good, right? So effective climate communication that truly resonates with people needs to include certain elements. So I listed a few of one. So, for example, connect the issue to the real pain and the real problems that people face in their daily lives. For example, rising food prices, health impacts, and even the risk of losing their lives due to the climate crisis, as well as the possibility of losing family members, the people that you love, right? So this is one of the biggest fear of the people. So it's important for us to make it clear that the climate crisis makes all this more vulnerable and possible, right? And these are among people's so biggest afraid. So it's important for them to understand that this is linked with a climate crisis. So the second one, uh, for example, here in climate politics, we increasingly advocate for fostering hope by showing that there are practical also ways to participate in politics and drive social change in their communities. So it's very important not only talk on the risks and fear, but also giving hope for people, bringing for them that it's possible to make the difference. So it's important bring in our storytelling emotions also that mobilizes people for the action, right? Um, and finally, through I don't want to exhaust all these tips. It's important to use social media strategically, so aiming to maximize reach and engagement. It's important to constantly follow viral formats, for example, that people are already using in their daily lives and adapting them to the narratives of climate crisis, for example. This was something that worked very well for us in our campaign to ban fossil fuels.
Thank you so much. And I mean, I think what I've seen in terms of communications, or rather the strategy this far, is protecting the integrity of information. But you highlight such an important point when you talk about bringing in emotion, bringing in storytelling, because I know that even for us as the Fossil Ad Band, that was the tipping point, or rather the turning point, is when we started sitting down with communities that are affected and not just saying, hey, you guys deserve better information. But when we started sitting down and listening to the type of information they got, debunking it and presenting that, not even on behalf, sometimes we have communities in the room, presenting what that the lack of information integrity did to them and bringing in the emotion. That's when you found so many decision makers kind of had a change of heart and having a deeper conversation. Perhaps then, with those strategies in mind, could you walk us through one example of how the Institute Climate Politics used communications to engage politicians, shape debate, or strengthen climate accountability in Brazil? And with that, what insights from that experience could strengthen climate accountability, maybe in different political contexts as well?
Sure. So basically, talking about the real impacts on people's daily lives, making these connections we don't usually make. So, such as physical and mental health, and the rising costs of living, rather than focus only on the causes of climate crisis, has generated a more engagement, right? But I also can share a recent case. We launched a guide to help cities to prepare for extreme heat due to the arrival of El Nino. So we took this advantage of this scenario where the media here in Brazil was already covering a lot this topic because um, the El Nino is arriving, right? So we took this advantage, and so we created this guide that serves as a practical solution, right? Not only talking on the problems, so we bring solutions for people and for the government. So we are offering 11 step-by-step instructions for city governments to prepare their cities. So we created for Instagrams, for social medias, a high visual carousel summarizing these guides in steps, and we call to people to action for to tag their city's politicians in the post, and we receive a lot of engagement. So we had about 70,000 views and over 100 comments only with politicians, and people tagging their politicians. And I believe that this was a very success communication. We drew enough attention that newspapers and politicians leads reached out to us to discuss the issue further. So I think some of the lessons of these communications are it's very important for communications to always include a call to action, for example, for the public, for example, tag some institution, tag some politicians, um, assess the website to send an email for some politicians, uh, etc. Um, we need to mobilize the people and bring clearly what we need that they do, right? And it's also important to make it clear in text and visually who is responsible for the political change. So bringing responsibility for the governments. And for example, adapting cities to streaming head is the city government's responsibility. This makes the communication more assertive with a purpose, right? And finally, unfortunately, we are seeing more evidence of the climate crisis effect on people. So I believe we must always keep an eye on the news and the debates on social media to understand the opportunities to communicate for proposing feasible political solutions as this, right? We saw a lack of practical solutions, how to adapt cities. So we used this opportunity to to make a campaign. And yeah, to sparking mobilization, social pressure is very important, and holding politicians accountable.
Thank you so much, Samantha. I think that's absolutely helpful because it doesn't just limit the action to organizations or experts, but even normal citizens can participate in change. Please do share that toolkit or that resource. We're more than happy to share it on our social media. Thank you so much for that. Next up, I would like to have a brief conversation with Nathan Stewart, coordinator of Fossil Free Politics. Now we get into the politics of things. People are always saying that you should keep politics out of, but politics is absolutely important in everything. I had a lecturer that used to say the personal is the politics. So, Nathan, first up, I wanted to dig deeper because right now we're trying to look at what needs to change. We've looked at what is sponsorship, we've looked at the strategies we can use in comms, but now we want to look at what needs to change currently. So, to you, um, fossil fuel advertising is visible, but lobbying often happens behind closed doors. How do these two forms of influence work together to shape climate policy and delay climate action?
Yeah, great question. And thanks a lot for the invite to speak today. Yeah, it's one of the big things that we have to reckon with in our work. And yeah, coming on to these kind of platforms and sharing the discussion with people working primarily on advertising is a real help for us at Fossil Free Politics. We mainly focus on the lobbying side. And yeah, I'm asking myself in preparation for this talk and in general, what is the difference and are there any similarities between lobbying and advertising? And I would already say that they are both forms of influence and that the fossil fuel industry uses both to further its goals. Yeah, the name of our organization is Fossil Free Politics, and you say that everything is political. But how do you influence politics? And I would just say that both lobbying and advertising are ways of generating influence towards a strategic goal for these companies. And we can talk more about what that goal is in a moment. But neither is worse or more important or more dangerous than the other. I think it's very important that we try and tackle both together. Um, if I can try and like define it a bit, I'd say lobbying generally focuses on the production side of fossil fuels and advertising on the more consumption side, but it's not always the case. Specifically, when targeting everyday consumers, it's more on the consumption side, so it's using fossil fuels for energy, whereas the lobbying is much more on the policies that are behind, yeah, the extraction and the consumption and the burning of fossil fuels for energy of various companies. So you're trying to cut it off at the source versus stopping people using it once it's already there, essentially. And lobbying as well is also more direct and active in terms of who it's trying to influence. It's targeting the big decision makers themselves. So anything from like presidents and people in the European Commission or prime ministers of countries or energy ministers, down to policy advisors of various different politicians. So it's much more direct. And then advertising can be most often indirect and passive. It targets people who happen to see the adverts. So we have to try and understand the difference of how these kind of things work. But yeah, as we see during this webinar, some advertising can overlap with and be seen as a type of lobbying. I think particularly what Peter was saying around the World Cup and Aramco sponsorship, I would say it's very much a lobbying type of action. And advertising is becoming more and more direct through technology and surveillance and different social media advertising is becoming much more targeted towards us. So it's not just this passive thing that we can choose to ignore. It's coming more and more into our lives. And that's the same for us as individual consumers looking to reduce our energy use and try and find more sustainable energy, but also for the decision makers themselves. There's a concept that over the last decade has been developed, especially in Brussels, but I think it's also in Washington, D.C. and other major world capitals, of digital public affairs, which is basically targeted advertising and different campaigns specifically for decision makers, so politicians and commission people, civil servants, for lobbying. So there's a lot of overlap where advertising can be used as a form of lobbying as well. I would say both the strategies are very deeply interconnected, and they're both trying to make a change to society that benefits these companies. Lobbying tries to shift policy, where advertising tries to build legitimacy in the eyes of the public for these policies. This legitimacy can then make the lobbying more effective, as industry representatives are seen as credible partners rather than like problem actors. And that's specifically the case of Aramco comes to mind again, where, yeah, you see them sponsoring the goals highlights of the World Cup, and then you think, oh, they must be a nice company, which then makes the cost to politicians meeting these companies much less because they're legitimate actors who just want to make football happen rather than profits for themselves. And yeah, by sponsoring high profile media events and political debates and discussions between academics and things like this, the industry buys a platform, literally buys our attention in order to platform and frame the terms of the climate debate and gain access to the decision makers. And really blurs the lines between what's public relations and political influence, and it can get very messy. So yeah, I'm very much talking about Europe here in this discussion, but I think it's the same across Africa and South Africa, where the fossil fuel industry are doing this for a reason. And that's something I really want to leave the discussion with today. It's not just because they're evil. It's not just because these individual lobbyists are wanting to make money, though of course they must get benefits and nice, tasty salaries that come along this. But it's because the logic of capitalism takes precedence over everything. If they don't make a profit, they don't survive. Anything that
Mm.
threatens the bottom line, anything that stops these companies making money, will hurt their ability to maintain an advantage against their rivals. It has to be defeated. It has to be gotten rid of, or at the very least, limited as much as possible. So that's the logic that we talk about when we're talking about lobbying. It's not just because they're these scary bad guys. It's because they want to really to maintain their profits at any cost. So I think attacking the advertising, which boosts their profits by selling their products, and attacking the lobbying, which can cut it off at the source, both can really come together to make an impact on the climate struggle that we're all part of. And if we hurt one side of it, we hurt the other. So we really have to work together.
100%. And I mean, one of the other examples was having Shell run the PR for last year's COP as well, in fossil fuel, or rather PR or lobbying being made, or rather giving fossil fuel companies more platform. So Fossil Free Politics is a coalition of more than 200 organizations working to reduce the influence of fossil fuel lobbyists on climate policymakers across Europe. From your experience, how can civil society successfully challenge fossil fuel influence in politics? And what strategies um, have been most effective in building political support for stronger climate action?
Yeah, so I mean, fossil free politics is just one aspect of a broader struggle that's been going on for decades at this point, and there's representatives of that struggle in the webinar today. So yeah, we take inspiration from and we build upon the work of the people who've gone before us, and we can learn from that. And different strategies work in different contexts. And I don't really have a magic button that we can press that will just work. But from what I can see, the one thing that works in every political struggle over history is getting people power behind your campaign is the thing that shifts things. Either you become big enough that you can't be ignored and the policymakers end up changing their minds, or you become big enough that you can seize power yourselves. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind when we're discussing these things is the more of us, the stronger we are. So calling ourselves a coalition and actively searching for new partners at all times is what really makes us stronger. The call for limiting the influence of the fossil fuel lobby, if it's coming from multiple actors at different levels and in different countries and across the world, it's much more stronger, and it gives us the legitimacy, but it also gives us the capacity, and we can spread out the work a little bit. So that's something that's been really helpful, is really just building these coalitions. But I think it's already even been mentioned on this call that, yeah, this isn't something new, but I just really wanted to reiterate that.
Mm.
And then also we don't just focus on one aspect of the campaign. We kind of offer a bit of a menu that supporters can kind of select, which is more or less winnable or relevant to their own local context, with an overall ask. So to kind of give a bit more detail on that, we've got like multiple entry points into the campaign underneath a central demand, which uses the metaphor of a firewall. If you already think of in a house, if there's one house that goes on fire and then you have a wall that blocks the fire spreading to the other buildings, or in technology, a firewall can stop a computer virus spreading from one to another. We want to put a firewall in place in climate policy that would really stop the influence of the industry from infecting or setting alight other policies. So that would be the overall ask, is basically cut the lobbyists out of the decisions. But within that, there's multiple things that campaigns can take on a national level, a local level, really grassroots, all the way up to the COP or the United Nations level. So we really want to limit the access that the fossil fuel industry actually gets to decision makers and politicians. So stopping taking meetings, don't be sitting on expert advisory bodies, don't be contributing to public research. to things like avoiding conflicts of interests. So there's the idea of this revolving door. So someone works in Parliament and then they go and work for the industry and then they come back into Parliament. We really want to cut that out and at least have some limits on that, and the very least transparency, if not completely to ban it if you've got a conflict of interest. There's also preferential treatment of the fossil fuel industry. And you bring up the example of COP, where Shell are the sponsors, but also the fossil fuel industry gets privileged access to the negotiations, and we really want to make sure that that doesn't happen. Um, and same on trade missions and international negotiations and things. Why should the fossil fuel industry get access to these things when it really affects all of our societies? And then, yeah, something that's maybe more relevant to the advertising side of things is one of our demands that we share with our members is to reject partnerships with the fossil fuel industry. So no sponsorships, no sharing platforms with industry representatives, don't host industry events and give donations to candidates or parties. And yeah, I think the advertising really fits in there. Don't be sponsoring these things and paying for advertising at events with either on-site or digital ads, or just kind of attaching your name to something that is a positive policy thing. If you put the fossil fuel industry right beside it, they kind of get some of that aura. So as well as those kind of like menu that have some things are more winnable in certain contexts than others, some things are going to be politically impossible. But at every point, we try and ask our members to kind of pick what level they want to campaign on. So it's about what can we do in our own individual workplaces and in our campaigns as an individual to try and to limit this, and then what can our organization do, and then yeah, what can our the climate movement, the environment movement work together and do and achieve together, and then yeah, what can we do on the national and international political policy level. So I think really having an understanding of your limits, but also your strengths in particular areas, and yeah, reach out to kind of creative coalitions, the kind of organizations that aren't traditional allies that can really help you achieve your goals together.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I like that a lot of the examples and advice that you give is very practical, because I think right now a lot of campaigners, we sit around a table and we say we're raising a lot of public awareness, but how are we influencing politicians? And that's where I wanted to dig a little bit deeper is how do we move from just public awareness to influencing politicians and turning public support into policy change? Just finally on that.
Yeah, I think that's goes much broader than this particular topic. I think if we could influence politicians to do what we want, we'd have a much better world. So again, I'm scared to give any special magic advice on this, but I think to come back to what I said before of just really it's about building a strong campaign backed by the people. They don't have to agree with us. They don't have to like what we want them to do, but we have to be stronger enough, and we have to change the balance of power so that we're unable to be avoided. And that can be on a small local community level, where like the local mayor or a certain company is shamed or embarrassed into doing something, or it can really be about bringing down the government in your national context because of something. But really, it's about identifying who is holding the power and how can we shift them through that. Raising awareness isn't going to be enough. I'm sure these lobbyists are well aware of what they're doing. It's not like they need to be told that what they're doing is wrong necessarily. I think the public still, in various countries, different contexts, there is some work to be done on the awareness side of things, but really that has to be the first step, and then you go beyond that to actually making an actual change. And yeah, the danger of public awareness campaigns is that we're trying to persuade people morally that this is the right thing to do, but we don't care whether it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. We care about winning. We care about being more powerful than them and beating them at their game. They don't have to agree with us, and appealing to their better natures. Sure, there might be one or two nice people working in these companies that we can kind of work from the inside, but that's a really long, slow game, and trying to convince them isn't going to cut it. I think Samantha, you spoke of all the different impacts of the heat waves in cities, and things are becoming more and more real for a lot more people than normal. And yeah, we don't have time. We don't have time to convince these people. We have to win. So yeah, building these big coalitions and building power in whatever way that looks like in our own local context is key.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nathan. Appreciate the practical elements of that. Thank you for sharing your expertise today. And just briefly, I wanted to move on to Beatrice Peggy, co founder and executive director of Institute Climate Politics. Um, I wanted to just dig into it was a bigger conversation that's being had in the climate space. How can elections, parliamentary processes, and international legal developments, such as maybe the ICJ advisory opinion, strengthen climate accountability and support stronger regulation of fossil fuel advertising?
Thank you, Azula. It's an honor to be here with all of you. Uh, I will be very brief in my answers because I think my colleagues already talked a lot about many of those elements. But the first thing about the international aspects, right? The ICJ advisory opinion, as it's in the name, it's an advisory opinion. So it's not something that's going to really tie the countries and force them to act a certain way. However, it is a very important precedent for when we deal with judiciary action. So when all the lobbying failed, all the campaigning failed, we can still rely on judges to use this precedent to have the governments be forced to take certain actions. So that is one of the possible advocacy strategies that can be used. And having these high level decision really helps with this kind of approach. However, of course, it's very expensive. Not every organization can have access to the judiciary system. But if you have a broader coalition or pro bono lawyers, this can be something that communities can put together and pursue. I also really like what Nathan said about having a firewall. I think this is the first time I hear firewall being used in a political way, but this is a way to create insulation of decision making. So this is something that we should pursue in elections and parliamentary processes. So we can really one aspect that was not mentioned is how many of the decision makers, they are there because they receive campaign money from big oil as well, so, and from different industries. So if we can create this kind of insulation in the processes for lobbying, but also the election process, this is a way that we can avoid this kind of economic capture of political power, right? And it is something that we have to really see that that's a tactic that authoritarian governments use. So they are already permeating these spaces and trying to really influence all spaces of decision making, including the judiciary one. So we can see that happening in the US, for example, with the extreme court nominations. And it's very hard to keep track of all of these different things that are happening at the same time, because we normally, nonprofits and this kind of social work has way less money and also has way less access to the spaces. And it's too much to keep track at the same time. So we really need to have a more coordinated strategy to create this kind of insulation. So we have at least someone in each of those spaces. Yeah.
Absolutely important having someone keeping tabs, because a lot of the times we just surprised and we have to scramble, put together strategies, but to have that clear person or that clear coordination strategy would definitely help us. So your organization has worked with municipalities as well as national institutions. Why is local government an important entry point for advancing climate action and fossil fuel advertising restrictions?
Well, let me see very quickly here my notes. The first thing, I feel like national wise policies can be very hard to achieve in a first goal. It's something that's way more bureaucratic. In Brazil, for example, you have to have people at the National Congress, you have to have people in the ministries. Not every organization is going to be in the capital city. But if you have, everyone is living in a city, and it's way closer to the people, and it's closer to daily life and daily concerns. So having this work with municipalities creates a race to the top instead of a race to the bottom. And that's something that we can harness this kind of power and the competition between rival cities, for example. And I would like to bring an example that happened during the FIFA World Cup as well. One huge crisis that's happening in Brazil, and I believe around the world, is the spread of addiction on gambling. So the virtual bets. And that's something that's ruining a lot of families. A lot of people are getting indebted with that. This became such a huge thing that bets were involved directly in advertisement during the World Cup.
Yes.
And this was even in bus stops in Brazil, in different cities. You see like the very fancy ads that they were putting together to encourage people to even bet on the World Cup results and all that. And what happened in Brazil is that some municipalities started banning these kind of ads. And they created this precedent of municipalities having the mandate to do that. Because in our law, there's also some discussion that maybe cities are not, they don't have the mandate to do that. But they have the mandate to regulate anything that's local interest. And this can also feed into the arguments pro municipalities having the mandate for regulating ads on fossil fuels as well. So that's why I think cities are very strategic, because one, they are way closer to you. You have access to your local decision maker. If not your mayor, you have access to a local legislator, so you can talk to them. They can propose things, and it's a way more insulated space. So it's easier for it to pass. It's easier for it to gain visibility in local news in that jurisdiction. And you can also harness the power of competition between cities, because after one city started doing that during the World Cup, many other capital cities of different states also did that. And then it becomes, oh no, I also want to be part of the good guys. I also want to be protecting the people, because it's something that had a lot of support. The anti-bet movement is very, very strong now, because it is affecting directly the economic livelihood of many, many families. So this is something that can be a good practice and a good way for people with less resources to also fight for the fossil fuel ad ban.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. I really wish we had more time. There's so much expertise within the different panelists today, but I do believe that we'll have around 2 and maybe around 3. There's so much to dig into, and there's so much work for us to do in terms of building a successful strategic coalition around fossil fuel ad bans from different industries. We've got football, we've got communications, we've got politics. There's so much that we can do together. And I would like to take this time to say thank you so much to everyone who has come through in terms of the audience. And I know other people are at work. This session is pre-recorded. It will be shared for larger engagement at a later stage as well. And I'm sure that we'll pick it up again when we're having our part 2 from here. So thank you very much to every single one of you guys. We've hunted you down. We're in different time zones, but you made time available for this conversation. Thanks so much to Zandi as well, part of the fossil fuel ad ban, running tech in the background. Thank you very much to everybody who has supported us up until now. From myself, Lazo Lagati, good afternoon, good evening, good night to everybody around who has joined. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.